Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to Second Chance Overland. I have a special project today. My buddy Tyler picked up this sweet 2022 Ford Bronco Badlands. And today we are going to be installing a lift kit on it. So stay tuned, enjoy the video. So this kit is from Maxlider Brothers, and they do have a video on their website, kind of going through the install. When I first watched it, I thought it was going to be a good video for a reference. But there's a lot of little things here and there where they just make a comment about doing something and don't really show you. All right, so we got the Bronco up in the air, got the wheels and tires off. We're going to start with the driver's front. We did tie off the steering wheel to make sure that it doesn't rotate because we do have to disconnect the steering linkage to the steering box. So we're going to start by taking off the brake caliper, which is a 15 millimeter. And we're going to use a bungee cord to tie this up and out of the way so it's not hanging by the brake line. Alright, so we also need to disconnect the sway bar. So the bottom of the sway bar to the control arm is a 21 millimeter. Now if the bottom of the sway bar starts to turn, there is a Allen recess in there. It takes a 6 millimeter Allen, and that will allow you to hold the sway bar post, keep it from turning while you undo the bolt. We also want to undo the tie rod here at the front. It is a 21 millimeter as well, and the bottom of it has an 8 millimeter for a wrench to hold the post from spinning. All right, so back behind the inner fender liner here is the steering column, and that bolt right there needs to come out so that you can pull the steering column up and out of that socket. All right, so now you can see we've got the steering column disconnected. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to undo the upper ball joint. So upper ball joint is a 18 millimeter. Now we got to separate the ball joint. All right, well, so that's why you keep the nut on it. All right, so I've got the bottom end supported with a jack. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna remove these lower bolts on the strut. And those are an 18 millimeter. All right, so this Bronco lift has been, quite frankly, an absolute pain in my ass. Yeah, it has not gone well. Not one step of the way. I was questioning the parts that they sent from the company we got them from Maxlider Brothers. Finally got through to them, which was a pain in the ass in its own right. But I finally got through to them. They assured me that it's the right kit, the right parts. So I proceeded. Didn't have the right ball joint puller in my kit. Luckily I had already ordered another one just in case, and so that showed up late yesterday. So the instructions all say you loosen everything up, blah 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 blah, undo your upper ball joint, all that stuff, and then you can undo the bottom of the strut bolts from the lower control arm and release it from there. No matter what I did, and I probably spent an hour messing with this, no matter what I did, I could not get the two bottom studs out of the strut, for the strut, out of the lower control arm. So I ended up just completely removing the whole steering knuckle and then removing the lower control arm to drop it off of the studs. If I had to do it over again, which I will be doing on another buddy's Bronco, I'm going to do that from the get-go. Just take the whole steering knuckle off, release your upper and lower ball joints, pull the steering knuckle off, drop that lower A-arm out. It's going to make it a lot easier. That ended up leading to my next issue. So the instructions specifically say to use the supplied bolts when you bolt the spacer on top of the strut. So here is the assembled strut with the spacer up top. Now they specifically tell you to use the bolts that they supply. So you cut the studs down so that they're flush or a little bit below the top of this spacer, because you don't want it to hit that before, you know, bottom out on that on the frame. So I cut the studs. I used the factory nut, knowing that we weren't going to be reusing it, to make sure that the threads were good and I didn't have any galled up threads on the end that were going to cause an issue. Then I proceeded to do the install with the nuts that they supplied. Started going on, and they are self-locking nuts, so they were a little bit, you know, they were tight to begin with. So after messing around with it, I thought, you know, I feel like I got some good, you know, first couple of threads of engagement. We're going to go ahead. So then keep plugging along, and the stud in the top of the strut hat started to turn, and it was locked up on the stud. The nut was locked up on the stud. So I had to disassemble the entire strut again, pull that top hat off, and then what I actually had to do was go in and clean up the top of the strut hat on the backside, and then tack weld that stud so that I can remove that nut. So we got that done. Called up Zone, which is who makes this part of the kit. Now we bought it from Maxlider Brothers, but Maxlider basically sends you out the Zone off-road lift kit, but upgrades to the BDS Upper Control Arms instead of the ones from Zone. So it's a little bit pricier to go through them than it is through Zone. But I called Zone, told him what was going on. He's like, man, that sounds pretty weird. Can you send me some photos, all this stuff? So I did that. In the meantime, I went to the local hardware store, and here's what I found out is that the bolts that they send you, or the nuts that they send you, are an M10 1.5. The factory studs on the top hat of the strut on this Bronco are an M10 1.25. So that's where my issue was. So I ended up having to get an M10 1.25 tap and die, whatever the correct term is for threading a stud, and had to go through and re-chase those threads so that I can get a good nut on it and get replacement nuts. Now Zone is doing the right thing. They are stepping up, and not only are they sending me different nuts for this, they're also sending me a new top hat. So unfortunately, it's going to be Monday before the parts show up at the earliest. It's now Friday. I can't have this thing on the lift all weekend long, and I'm actually getting ready to leave town, so there's a good chance that if they show up on Monday, I don't have enough time to get this thing done and back together, and I need the lift. I've got it all tapped out. I've got new nuts on there. Everything's holding back together. Strut is assembled, and we can finally move on. So word of caution, if you're doing this kit, before you go to bolt the nuts onto the top hat of the strut, where you're bolting the spacer onto the top hat, double check your thread pitch. Somewhere along the way, it looks like Ford has changed their thread pitch on those bolts. You do not want to be in the situation I'm in, where you just cost yourself half a day. That's it. Let's get moving on this again and see if we can get it wrapped up. So now that we got the strut out, I've marked it where everything is. This strut hat needs to turn 180 degrees. So we've got it in the spring compressor. We're going to loosen up this nut. You definitely want to support it on the bottom. All right, so we got the strut out of the spring. So we're going to take this collar off, the dust boot. Now we need to take this lower strut mount off, and this cap has to come off with it. So, okay, so now the strut is torn apart. Now we're going to take this spacer, slide it over the top so that it goes right into that groove right there. The lower spring mount goes on. Put the cap back on. Now the dust boot will go back on, and then the little white preload spacer goes on top of that. From our marks, we want to rotate just the strut top 180 degrees so that when we reassemble it, it's in the correct position where we want it. So now we can go ahead and reinstall this in the spring. All right, so we got the strut all put back together. Now these front spacers are tapered. There's one end that's bigger than the other. So what you want is the high side to the outside of the vehicle, which is opposite of where the reservoir is. So it's going to go on like that, and then we're going to mark these studs on where we need to trim them. Now we can start trimming the studs. Alright, so now that we got the studs trimmed, we take our spacer, we put the supplied bolts in, and then line it up with the studs here. You just want to remember that you want the taller part towards the outside of the vehicle. Put washers on, and then the nuts. All right, so now that we got the strut all put back together and ready to go, I've got the new BDS Upper Control Arm in, so we can start putting things back together. It is just one long bolt that goes through both ends through this part of the frame here. So you got to kind of lift this up and over through here and down into the little notches. So next thing we're going to do while everything's torn apart and we got good access, we're going to hook the steering column back up, and then we'll start getting the rest of the suspension put together. So. I figured out a little trick on getting the bottom of the strut out of the bottom of the lower control arm. As you can see, these studs are pretty long, and that A-arm does not come down straight down. It comes down at an arc, which is why on the other side I removed the control arm so that I can just drop it out. When I was putting it back together, I struggled, finally worked through some things and figured out what to do. And what I found is a big set of, or a big crescent wrench. What you can actually do is put it on that bar and then use that to use leverage to rotate it. So as you bring the control arm up, and it's hard to do without extra set of hands right now, and trying to hold a camera. Like that. Now we've at least got them started, and I've got somebody coming to help me so that I can do a little bit easier. What I did on the other side was I used a jack to put pressure on the control arm while I torqued on the lower pin on the strut. That's the trick I figured out. Worked really well, especially on removal. Once I got everything loosened up, I did loosen the control arm on this side. I didn't fully remove it. I just loosened the bolts on it so that it will swing fully out of the way. When it's tight, it's not going to want to swing. It's going to be held on with the rubber bushing, so it's not going to swing out of the way. So removing it, I was able to loosen up the control arm, put the crescent wrench on it, give it a little pressure, and the thing dropped right out. So much easier what I was trying to do before. And with that, you probably don't need to remove the entire sway bar from the frame. So that's a bonus there as well. So a lot easier than what the instructions say. The instructions say it's optional to use an air hammer to pop the studs out of the bottom of the strut. I hope this helps somebody out there, because it would have been pretty damn helpful for me. All right, so we got everything back together. The strut's in, control arms are in. Everything's put back together with the exception of the sway bar because I still have the other side to do. So we'll get started on that, get that done, and this thing will be wrapped up and ready for the alignment. All right, so that's going to do it for this video on the Bronco lift kit. It definitely was a challenge doing it for the first time, but I've learned a lot about doing this kit. I do have another buddy's Bronco that we're doing the same thing on here soon, so I will probably do another video on that, going a little bit more detail onto the tips and tricks that I've learned while doing this, so it could be a little bit smoother and easier for you. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with all of the other projects and adventures. And don't forget to hit that little bell notification button so you can be notified when we drop new videos. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time on Second Chance Overland.